A nurse, a doctor, and a CEO of the largest insurance company all died on the same day. When they arrived at the pearly gate, St. Peter asked them all what they had done on earth to merit entry into heaven. The nurse said, "I've cared for people my whole life, bathing them, changing sheets and bedpans, giving them medicine." And St. Peter said, "That's wonderful. Welcome to paradise." The doctor said, "I've devoted my life to helping the sick, curing those inflicted with diseases, and healing thousands." St. Peter said, "That's wonderful. Welcome to paradise." Finally, St. Peter turned to the CEO, who said, "I was the president of the largest HMO in America and responsible for ensuring the health care of millions of people." And St. Peter said, "That's wonderful. Welcome to paradise. You can only stay 2 nights, and it's going to cost you $100,000. If you think the healthcare system in our country is messed up, imagine what it was like to be a leper in first century Judea. In the ancient world, leprosy was used to describe a broad range of skin diseases. And Levitical law stated that if someone was seen with any spot or rash or irregularity of any kind on their skin, that they had to be brought before a priest, not a doctor, but a priest, who would examine their skin and determine if it was leprosy. It was not a very scientific process. There was no treatment for leprosy, and it was highly contagious. So if a priest thought someone was developing it, whether they were or not, he would proclaim them ritually unclean, which meant they would be immediately separated from their family, removed from society, and quarantined in small communities where the only way to survive would be to beg. Once a person had been declared unclean, they could only re-enter society when they were healed. And so they had to present themselves back to the priest for another health exam and hope to be declared clean. All the power was in the hands of the priest to determine who was sick and who was well. Can you imagine if you had to get a note from your pastor saying that you were clean before you could go home from the hospital or back to work? Lepers were trapped in a vicious system that left them dehumanized and alienated from community. There were rules and regulations that cut lepers off from the rest of society to protect the health and well-being of everyone else, which is why the 10 lepers in Luke 17 called out to Jesus from afar. "Jesus, have mercy on us," they shouted. They were being conscientious of their status in society and did not want Jesus or any of his disciples to contract their ailment or to be declared unclean, so they stood from a distance and simply shouted out for mercy. Thankfully, leprosy today has been a fully curable disease since the 1940s, and in 2016, health officials introduced a vaccine to prevent it. Yet sadly, hundreds of leper colonies still exist today, only one in America, but many of them in places like India. Scholars claim that the reason we continue to have leper colonies today, even though leprosy has been cured, is that the cultural stigma has proven much harder to eradicate than the disease itself. When societies collectively quarantine or segregate a portion of their population, the stigma lasts longer than the original reasons. Last weekend, our group of pilgrims who walked through Montgomery together were starkly reminded of the horrifying consequences of the enduring stigmatization of African Americans in this country as less than human, dangerous, guilty, or criminal, and how that was used repeatedly to justify slavery, lynching, segregation, and mass incarceration. And yet there are other groups who have been quarantined and cut off from our society today: the housing insecure, the mentally ill, the immunocompromised. What is our responsibility to those who have been cut off and cast out, segregated from our society? The 10 lepers and their story testify to us that Jesus was a healer. However, Jesus not only felt compassion for the sick and offered them healing, a crucial part of his healing ministry was also to restore people, to restore the people that society had segregated and stigmatized. In the Gospels, we notice that healing was never simply a personal, individual, or biological process. It was always social and communal, a spiritual act of holistic restoration. Therefore, if we desire to follow in the footsteps of Jesus today, if we want to be true healers like Jesus was, we must also be people who not only feel compassion and offer good medicine to the sick, but people who actively work to try and restore people whose society has segregated and stigmatized. The poor and the marginalized, the oppressed, the housing insecure, the mentally ill, the immunocompromised. The lepers in this story were likely not expecting to be healed, but hoping that Jesus would simply take pity on them and give them some charity. Without any knowledge of Levitical law, it's hard to understand why Jesus said, "Go and show yourself to the priest." It sounds a little cold, as if he was dismissing them, refusing to touch the lepers and making them somebody else's problem. However, the reality is that Jesus knew the only way the lepers could return to their families and society was to be declared clean by a priest. And Jesus didn't have the power to fully restore them back to the community in that way. So he freed them from their disease and then sent them back to the only people who could restore them. But the story of the 10 lepers would just be another story of healing if it weren't for what happened next. One of the 10 lepers did something completely unexpected. After recognizing that he'd been healed, he turned back, praised God with a loud voice, laid down at Jesus' feet, and said, "Thank you." The German mystic Meister Eckhart once said, "If the only prayer you ever pray in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough." The longer I live, the more I believe that many of our world's biggest problems began at first somewhere with a lack of gratitude. Greed is a lack of gratitude for resources we already have. Climate change, a lack of gratitude for the earth. Misogyny, a lack of gratitude for women. Racism, a lack of gratitude for people of color. Homophobia, a lack of gratitude for LGBTQ people. Xenophobia, a lack of gratitude for people of other nations and ethnicities. Before we begin to hate, to marginalize, to oppress, to hurt people, animals, the earth, at some point, we stop being grateful for them. It's hard to hate and marginalize and hurt and be grateful at the same time. But the tricky part is that gratitude is not just an attitude and an emotion or even the power of positive thinking about the things that we've been given. Gratitude is a practice. It's a ritual, a way of life. And the absence of the practice of gratitude in our lives is a path that almost always leads to catastrophe and ruin. Before Jesus could say anything in response to the leper's gratitude, the author of Luke interrupts the story with a narration that simply says, "And he was a Samaritan." It's startling and out of place in this story, leaving us asking, why do we need this information? Who cares if he was a Samaritan? What does that have to do with this story? Why tell us this now? The Jews had been at odds with the Samaritans since the civil war between the northern and the southern kingdoms, because Samaritans believed the proper place to worship was Samaria, not Jerusalem. They were Semitic people, like the Jews, biologically related, but their theological perspective had transformed them into a different ethnicity, outsiders who were no longer welcome in the Jewish community. And the only reason that Luke would say that the leper was a Samaritan was to illustrate how much more different he was from Jesus, the disciples, and the other lepers. He was not only a leper, but a foreigner, a leper among lepers, a double outsider of twofold uncleanliness with the wrong theology and the wrong ethnicity. And yet, amazingly, he's the only one of the lepers who turned back to give thanks. And when he did, Jesus didn't ask him where he was from or what his theology was or where he thought the temple should be. All Jesus said, "Were not 10 made clean? Where's the other 9? Were none others able to return and give thanks to God except this foreigner? Get up, go on your way, Your faith has made you well. This story bears a striking resemblance to the healing of Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army in 2 Kings 5, who was healed by the prophet Elisha. He was also a foreign enemy of Israel who wanted to be healed from leprosy at a distance and then returned to give thanks to the prophet. What these stories have in common and what they teach us is that the healthy religious insiders with the right theology and the right ethnicity often have a difficult time responding to with gratitude to the work of God in our lives and in our worlds. And typically in the Bible, it is the poor and the marginalized, the sick, the diseased, the outsiders and the foreigners who see and respond favorably to the work of God. It's the people we'd least expect who display the greatest faith. A faith so great, in fact, that according to Jesus, it was powerful enough to make a person well, no matter what their theology or ethnicity may be. At first glance, the words of Jesus to the Samaritan don't seem very special. Get up, go on your way, your faith has made you well. It sounds like a repetitive thing to say since the Samaritan had already been healed. Was Jesus simply restating the gift of healing he'd already given? This is one of those occasions where things get lost in translation. In the version we heard this morning, the end of Jesus' remarks are, your faith has made you well. But the Greek word there is not well-being. It's the Greek word zozo, which is the word for salvation. Jesus wasn't being repetitive or reminding the Samaritan that he'd already been healed. Jesus was granting him something else entirely, something new. In response to his gratitude, Jesus granted the leper a new gift of being made completely whole, the gift of liberation. He told the Samaritan, the leper, get up, go on your way, your gratitude has saved you. Your gratitude has saved you. 10 lepers were healed, but only one returned thanks, and that one received salvation. And this is important because we all want to know what Jesus considered to be the kind of faith that can save us and save our world, make us whole, lead to liberation and peace. Here it is. The Samaritan's faith is that kind of faith. The only thing that distinguished him from the other lepers was that he returned thanks. He was grateful, so grateful he could not keep walking without returning to offer his gratitude. The kind of faith the Samaritan had was a faith that returns thanks, a grateful faith, a faith founded on gratitude. It didn't matter that he was a leper or a Samaritan or a foreigner from the wrong place who believed the wrong things. All that mattered was that he gave thanks. Gratitude saved him. In addition to helping us avoid the worst evils in human history, gratitude also has the power to help us manage the stress that is bearing down on all of us in America today. I was reminded by a friend this week that neurological researchers have discovered that we cannot be anxious and grateful at the same time. Our brains just don't work that way. Anxiety and gratitude are linked to an activity in the brain that produces neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and hormones like cortisol. Studies have shown that gratitude reduces our anxiety by optimizing the functioning of the nervous system, triggering the same neurotransmitters involved in anxiety. And as it turns out, our brains can't respond to both at the same time. It's one or the other. Which means that by intentionally practicing gratitude, over time, we can train our brains to feel less anxious. There are, of course, neurodivergent folks and people with clinical anxiety who don't have this ability to choose. But for many of us, we can either feel anxious or grateful, but not both. So in the midst of all of our anxieties about family and friends and finances and physical ailments, school and work and church and the war in Europe, political divisions in America, fascism on the rise, democracy on the brink, radical economic disparity, bigotry, church decline, a continuing global pandemic, a failing healthcare system, the holidays quickly approaching, dinner with our families around the table coming. Let's take a moment right now together to pause and think of something we're grateful for. I'll wait. Take a moment. ancestors knew something that we've forgotten, an ancient wisdom. Gratitude is a spiritual practice that can help us manage anxiety. That's why we've developed this habit of saying grace or thank you before we eat our meals, or why so many religious traditions and spiritual practices begin with offering gratitude to our ancestors, our Creator, the force that we live and move and have our being in. Devout Jews were known to give thanks to God 100 times a day. In fact, one rabbi wrote, "Blessings, gratitude to God keeps our awareness of life's holy potential ever present. They awaken us to our lives. With each blessing, we extend the boundaries of the sacred and ritualize our love of life. 100 times a day, everywhere we turn, everything we touch, everyone we see, we say, thank you." Before Christians called it communion or the Lord's Supper, the ritual that we will participate in today was called the Eucharist, which is an old Greek word that means to give thanks. And the root of the word Eucharist is charis, which means grace. To give thanks is to receive grace. And the central practice of our faith is not only a remembrance that Jesus lived and died for the sake of our liberation and salvation, but an opportunity for us to offer our gratitude to our Creator. Gratitude for our lives and everything that we've been given. Gratitude for our families and our friends and the way of Jesus. Gratitude for our church, for all God's people, for each other, for our neighbors, for the world. Today and every day when we come to this table, we come to practice gratitude, to give thanks. And that act of giving our gratitude to God has the mysterious power to save us all. At the end of the movie, Don't Look Up, any hope for saving humanity from the giant comet barreling toward Earth has been lost. And the scientists who have discovered this comet have done everything they can to alert the population, but they were ignored. And so while the wealthy few and the political leaders are boarding an escape ship to leave Earth, the film's central characters gather in their last moments together, alive, to have a meal. Their own version of the Lord's Supper. Very few of them even believe in God, and yet they sit around a table together and they share words of gratitude. One of the scientists says, "I'm grateful that we tried." Another wonders aloud if they should say amen, but they're not a very religious family. Then a quiet boy named Yule, who is played by Timothy Chalamet, begins to pray, "Dearest Almighty Creator, we ask for your grace tonight despite our pride, your forgiveness despite our doubt. Most of all, God, we ask for your love to soothe us through these dark times. May we face whatever it is to come in your divine will with courage and open hearts of acceptance. Amen." The power of this simple prayer was the call to gratitude for the gift of life, the opportunity to live and breathe amid the uncertainty and darkness we all face, and to possess the will to try, regardless of whether we will succeed or fail. As Meister Eckhart said, if the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough. He was right. A lot of the problems that plague our lives and our world began with a lack of gratitude. And it's almost impossible to be anxious and grateful at the same time. We can neither do one or the other. Which means that if we're willing to practice this powerful gift of gratitude, it will be enough. In fact, if we can do it long enough, and if we can do it together, it might just be enough to save us. Amen.